All right, welcome and thank you for joining our webinar today with cybersecurity expert Derek A. Smith. 5 key areas to consider when building an effective vulnerability management program. You are also joined by Beyond Trust security engineer Joe Stapp, who will run us through a Beyond Trust overview and demo towards the end of the webinar, so I encourage you to stick around for that. My name is Sarah, your webinar host today. Nice to see you all here. A kind reminder to please submit your questions via the chat box in the GoToMeeting console. You should find that on the side of your screen. And go ahead and submit those questions anytime throughout the webinar, and I will be monitoring those throughout, and then we'll cover your questions at the end during our Q&A time. Also, today's session is being recorded, and all attendees will receive a link to the recording and the slides shown here today within 1 business day from now. So at this point, I'd like to hand it on over to Derek, who will jump right in. He has a lot of content to show today and a lot of strategies for an effective vulnerability management program. So without further ado, please take it away, Derek.
Hi, thank you very much, Sarah. Hello, everybody. It's good to be here again with Beyond Trust and with you all. And as she stated, today I want to talk about vulnerability management. And as you all know, vulnerability management, patch management, those are 2 of the most important things you can do in your environment to kind of ensure your safety, kind of make your organization a bit more secure, working with this in hand with other things, other technologies and practices and strategies you can put in place. So with that being said, I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to give you 5 key areas to consider when you want to build your own program, your own vulnerability management program, and make it more effective. So let's go right into it. So first, let's level set on exactly what I mean by vulnerability management programs and policies, and also patch management. And I'm going to start with vulnerability management and vulnerability assessments. So in order to have an effective program, you have to do vulnerability assessments. And with that, you have to have a policy, because that policy drives your program. And everything you do should go to that policy and therefore go to your organization's strategy. So that policy is there to establish controls and processes that's going to help you identify vulnerabilities within your technology infrastructure and your information system components that you might have in place. That could be exploited by attackers if they're trying to gain unauthorized access to your system, or disrupt your business operations, or steal your sensitive data, or even leak your sensitive data out to others. Now, the purpose of patch management and that patch management policy is for you to identify controls and processes that's going to provide appropriate protection against threats that could adversely affect the security of your information system, or the data that's entrusted to your information system if you're in healthcare field, or if you're in the credit card industry or something like that. So effective implementation of those controls is going to create a consistently configured environment for you that is going to be secure against known vulnerabilities in your operating system or your application software. And I say known vulnerabilities because if we're doing vulnerability management and we're doing scans and assessments, we only can assess what we know already. You know, if it's a 0-day attack and we don't know anything about it yet, that scan is probably not going to find it. And we'll get into that later on. So let's get into the 5 processes that you want to have in place. First thing you want to have is a threat monitoring process. And threat monitoring is the ongoing process of you gathering information about new and emerging threats that's out there that could affect your IT assets, the different things you have in your organization. Now, this is going to be different for every organization because it depends on your particular situation, it depends on your industry, and it depends on what your needs are. But whatever it is, you need to have a threat monitoring process of some type. And in that process, your security team, your security individual, whoever you may have, they're going to have to gather information on those current, new, and emerging threats, right? And then that threat information needs to include your vendors, any vendors you have. So if there are vendor notifications out there for those threats, if there's patches, if there's system updates, if there are security information exchanges that you're going to get involved with, like US CERT, you need to use your vendors and third parties as part of your threat monitoring process. Another thing is that the technologies that you're tracking in that threat monitoring process has to be determined from the types of technologies, again, that's present in your present inventory. in your inventory of your technology assets, because again, it's going to be different depending on what you have. And the last piece you see, the last bullet, is that those threats that you identify have to be resolved, and they're going to be resolved according to your vulnerability remediation management strategy or plan that you have in place, because it's going to be, again, your own unique situation. So again, first thing you do is your threat monitoring process. The second thing you do is you need to go out, and once you have a process and a plan, you go out and you conduct your vulnerability assessment. You actually do the assessment. So when you look at how you're going to do your assessment, the first thing you need to, well, let me say this. Let me take a step back. When you do a vulnerability assessment, that's going to be what we call a point-in-time snapshot or a point-in-time exercise that's going to be used to identify and analyze those vulnerabilities that you have in your place at that particular time against your technology assets. So that vulnerability assessment you're going to do is going to focus on your current operations and include your process, your procedures, and your current state of your technology assets. Okay? So when I do this, you have to, or you, me, whoever, your organization, they have to establish a formal program that has defined roles, as you see in the first bullet, defined roles and responsibilities for managing vulnerability scans and assessments in that process. And it should include these four things. There should be development and management of your vulnerability assessment processes and procedures. It should be an actual process in place, a repeatable process that we follow, that we're going to use every time we go and do a vulnerability assessment. There should be architectural reviews. You should look at your entire infrastructure to see what it is that we really have to assess. Where are all our assets? You know, make sure that we cover everything when we do this. So do architectural review. Security controls, limitations, network connections, your restrictions, they have to be tested to make sure that they're conforming with applicable standards and compliance and things like that are also in place. And then your internal and external vulnerability scans have to be run, I would recommend, at least quarterly. Now, it depends on your particular situation. You know, some organizations I've been in, we ran monthly scans. You know, Army Research Lab, we did monthly. You might want to do it quarterly. You have to determine what's going to be best for you, but you do have to determine it, and you do have to have a plan. So I say that you should have run them at least quarterly. Now, you're going to have internal scans and you're going to have external scans. Your internal scans should be conducted after any significant change occurs in your network. So not just quarterly, but if you bring a new system component in and you install that, or if there's a change in your network topology or firewall modifications, or rule modifications, or whatever it may be, you might want to do an internal scan. Now, for external scan, I always recommend that you bring in a vendor certified by whatever industry you're in. If you're in the payment card industry or if you're in the healthcare industry, bring the experts in. Let the experts come in at least once a year, if you can't do it more, and let them do a scan conducted after those network changes or anything like that, to give you a second eye, a second opinion, and perhaps an even more expert opinion as to what your vulnerabilities may be. Continue with that. I talked about bringing in external folks, so you might want to deploy penetration testing. Penetration testing, I would recommend, should be conducted at least once a year. And again, if there's any significant infrastructure or application upgrade changes or modifications to your systems or something like that, major releases, then you want to do it quicker than that. You want to do it more often than that. Now, when I do my penetration test, I would want to do two different things. I want to do a network layer penetration test where I'm actually examining the network to see what's actually on my network, and I want to do an application layer penetration test to take a look at the applications that I'm deploying in my environment. Now, these processes and these procedures have to include follow-up actions that's going to leverage my IT asset management data or program, you know, my configuration information, my patch levels and all that. I have to have a process in place that's going to follow up on this, because the job for me is to validate and track those findings in order to determine the appropriate remediation efforts. It makes no sense to do a vulnerability assessment and then do a penetration test, get a file, get a report, and then don't do anything with it. So it's important to have that built into your policy, that this is what we're going to do and what amount of time we're going to do it in. those vulnerabilities that's identified have to be resolved, and it should be done in accordance with that remediation management process or plan, again, that I mentioned before that you should have in place. Another point that we have is configuration management. So configuration management is the practice of standardizing the configuration of similar technology assets based on I'm reading the slide here, based on basically based on documented configurations that you develop by subject matter experts who actually understand the documentation, understand the procedures and processes that you have in place. So it's going to be in accordance with what I said before, always in accordance with your applicable policies, and then it should be approved by functional leadership. So those people who we always talk about bottom up and top down. In this case, I'm thinking a top down approach, because the folks who have boots on ground, hands on the network, who's actually doing the work, they're going to know what the vulnerabilities are most often, and they're going to also understand the processes enough to help you put together a good configuration management plan and process. Okay? In that plan, there's some things you should do. You have to document your baseline configurations for all the technology assets that you have within your organization. And when you standardize this, it should be designed in compliance with whatever applicable security requirements you have for, again, your organization. They need to be kept up to date by the different functional areas that's in your organization that's going to be responsible for your technology assets. Okay? And the last thing I have there is that you need to go and integrate that as part of your system build process when you're first building out or implementing your system into production. And then you need to consistently enforce this across all those functional areas. I work for the IRS right now. I'm a program manager over there, and oftentimes we're not talking to the functional managers or working close enough with our business partners, our developmental partners, our functional managers, to make sure that they're included in all the thought processes and decision making that takes place. Another thing is that me, as in the PMO realm, the project management office, I have to ensure that they are consistently, again, enforcing configuration management in everything they do, and change management. I'm going to talk about change management in a little while, in everything they do when they're working through this process. And then all that technology, all your technology assets has to be configured consistent with the applicable baseline configuration that we come up with together. And I'm saying us in security, we in security, as well as those functional managers, those functional areas. Once we do those things, we move over into vulnerability remediation management. So this is another step of those 5 you want to have in place. Now, vulnerability remediation management is where we evaluate the vulnerabilities that we identified during our vulnerability assessment process. We're going to assign we're going to look at the risks that we have to our organization, and then we're going to assign risks based on the likelihood and impact that those vulnerabilities are going to have if they're exploited. We're going to look at planning an appropriate response to those should something happen. We're going to look at tracking those responses through completion, through mitigation process. If it's a POAM, you use POAMs through the POAM process. And then we're going to go back and periodically verify that these things are completed. So examples of processes that provide input to that vulnerability remediation management process or program include things like that technology risk assessment. We should always, how can we know what to protect and how we're going to protect it if we don't do a risk assessment first and determine what our risks are and what our critical systems are and what we should rate first and all that, and I'll get to that in just a minute. Our threat monitoring that I talked about earlier is going to go into our remediation management process, and again, those vulnerability assessments we do are going to drive what it is that we're trying to fix. Okay? When we're looking at it, as you see on my third bullet, the determination of risk must take into account, what you have to do is you have to evaluate the relevance of those reported vulnerabilities you have, identify that associated risk that I was talking about to your technology assets, and then you have to take into account your hardware details, your software versions, your configuration of your information systems as you recorded them in your asset inventory and all that. The second thing, you have to look at the likelihood of that particular vulnerability occurring. And then if it should occur, what's going to be the impact to your organization? And then you have to look at the applicable compensating controls that you're going to put in place in order to mitigate whatever those findings are. All right. Next, the respective stakeholders, everybody's involved from your organization, they have to be notified immediately when there's a reason to believe there has been or might be an impact to your confidentiality, your integrity, and your availability. Remember, everything revolves around those three things, that CIA triad. So if there's going to be a problem, basically you need to tell people there's going to be a problem. Right? And when I worked at Booz Allen Hamilton, you know, when we were attacked by Anonymous, and that's common knowledge, and my job, I was the incident response coordinator. So my job was not only to coordinate internally and communicate internally, but remember, we're Booz Allen. We have thousands of external customers. And we had to figure out how we were going to message that, what we would tell people, and how much information we want to give to those customers as well. But there were stakeholders, so they had to be, you know, we had to bring our stakeholders in as early as possible so it won't look like you're not doing what it is that you're supposed to do. Okay? So again, those stakeholders need to be told as soon as we can possibly tell them. And then all your system components, excuse me, and your software have to have the latest vendor supplied security patches installed within an appropriate amount of time. What's appropriate for your organization has to be determined. And also, those things have to be approved by change management. I'm going to get into change management in a little while. But as you all know, as security professionals, you should never make a change to your system without going through some type of change management process, no matter how small it is. I say that, but I used to travel the country doing, you know, it may sound basic, but when I traveled to the country doing certification and accreditation inspections, many people would make changes without going through a change management process, especially if it was easy and it didn't take time. You know, sysadmin would tell me, well, you know, security guy came to me or whomever came to me and asked me to make a change. I knew it was only going to take 2 or 3 minutes, so I went ahead and did it. Well, you know, if you people in security know that that's the wrong thing to do, because even if it takes 2 to 3 minutes to change it, we have no idea what the effect on our organization and our network is going to be. So that's a no-no. Has to be a change management process with some checks and balances, right? Okay. Now, the next thing we have to do is our organization has to identify an appropriate response to each technical vulnerability that we find based on risk and based on the alternatives that we have available to deal with those vulnerabilities. So that response might consider, well, not might consider, if you look at my second bullet, it has to consider the root cause of that vulnerability. Before we start throwing things in place, doing fixes, we have to know what it is we're trying to fix. And you will find that sometime, if you don't understand the root cause, you may put time, effort, and resources into fixing the wrong things. Okay? So that technical vulnerability resolution may, among other things, include software releases and compensating controls. Now, when I talk about software releases, if a software release is available to fix that vulnerability, you need to use it. But before you use it, it needs to be tested and it needs to be deployed following some type of proper change management process again. So depending on the urgency of that, of the deployment of that change request may be submitted on for an emergency change request so you can do it quicker. But there should be some testing. As you all know, you should never take a patch and put it directly into your production environment without some type of testing. Because a patch, as we know, it might be a patch, but that patch can break. Right? It can break some of our systems. And the second thing is a compensating control. So the compensating control, if no software, and it's going to happen sometimes, especially if it is a zero-day attack or something like that, if no software release is available to address your vulnerability or the situation you find yourself in, or if the deployment of that software release is determined to create an unacceptable risk for your organization, then you might have to use some type of alternative control. And that alternative control can be deployed to try to quickly prevent exploitation of their vulnerability even further. You have to triage, right? You have to stop the bleeding first and then try to figure out what it is you can do for a long-term fix. I'm sorry, I can't get it out. So in the case of the software release approach, just like software release, compensating controls can be done in an emergency situation as well. Next, we look at the vulnerability in the patch, and I'm going to look at this process in detail. But you've done your assessment. You kind of figure out what your vulnerability management program is going to look like. Now, let's just start actually applying those patches. And I give you a step-by-step process here. You can do it many different ways, but this is one way you can look at it. The first thing you have to do, of course, is identify what the problem is. So, and not only that, but identify how you go, what process you're going to put in place. So the processes that you have to be in place in order first to identify those threats and vulnerabilities to your critical business information and the different software and things that you have in place. And then once you identify what those are, you're going to look at the internal controls. So your internal security controls and the services you have must be used to identify suspected or confirmed attacks that you have in your environment against your critical information systems. Sometimes there are attacks going on for months or years that you don't even know about, and you won't know about it until you do a thorough vulnerability assessment or penetration test, which is part of vulnerability assessment, of course. So it's going to include these things. You got to go back and look at devices that, well, I'm not look at it, but have devices that detect and prevent known attacks. IDSs, firewalls, IPSs, things like that. Those devices, you have to have devices in place that monitor critical files. And you need to have devices in place that capture and analyze suspicious or unauthorized access into your environment. So first we start with identification. I'm not done yet because we're going to continue on with that just for a second. Now, I talked about penetration testing before. Again, it has to be used to identify and confirm those vulnerabilities that we might have in our environment, either on our hardware, or our software, or both of them that support our critical information systems again. So it needs to include the following that I have here at least. You need to have an annual external test of your network infrastructure and your applications by, again, independent penetration testers. Now, you may employ penetration testers within your organization, but I'll tell you, sometimes they're so used to looking at the environment that they may miss something. But not only that, not to take anything away from your penetration testers, but the folks who do this, the third parties that do this for a living, they have looked at many, many different organizations. And they've gotten ideas and points and all that that we just may not know about with the 2 or 3 guys we have in our own organization. So bring in an external tester to take a look at your, to do an independent test of your organization. Now we can, of course, do the annual internal testing as well. So I want to do an annual internal test of my network infrastructure and applications by folks that we've trained or have on staff as our penetration testers. Okay. Also, you look at it 2 different ways too. External and internal. I can have external also be an outside party without any information on my organization, try to penetrate my system, try to penetrate my infrastructure. As an internal test, I can still use an external company, but I bring them in and I give them the information they need to do an internal assessment or internal penetration test. So you can still use external folks for the internal testing. It's just that they will have more information. You've heard of white box and black box and gray box testing. So that's where you're going to deploy this. Now, the testing of any new hardware or software and after a significant change before going live should be done as well. So if there's a change like a major software release, or you have a new application you want to put in place, or new products or whatever, of course, when you do that, you should do a penetration test, okay? Because it still can affect your organization. And then as we go on, we should do retests. So retests should be performed to confirm that those exploitable or high-risk vulnerabilities were actually mitigated. Because we put a control in place, if we don't test it, we don't know if it's working. You know, part of every stage is to do monitoring and then to do a retest to make sure that that compensating control actually did what it is that you wanted it to do. So that's going to be important. All right. Now, that vulnerability scanning should be done regularly. I'm not going to give you dates, times, 3 months, 2 months, quarterly, whatever. I said before you should do it quarterly. It may be monthly for you. It may be daily depending on the criticality of the information in your organizations, but they should be done regularly. And you do that to identify those vulnerabilities on that hardware and software, again, that support your business critical information systems. So they need to include, remember that on the last slide, we talk about your penetration testing time. Here, I'm talking about the vulnerability scanning, at least quarterly. Quarterly external scanning again on your internet-facing infrastructure and your applications. Quarterly external and internal scanning. Scanning again after significant change. You've heard that before. Rescanning to make sure that it took. If you have wireless, I'm sorry I covered that up, but if you have wireless in your environment, you want to do quarterly wireless scanning for your your LANs, and portable wireless devices and USBs and all that that's connected to your system. Because this is a little bit more difficult for us as security people right now. So make sure you're checking that as well. And then an incident response plan needs to be put together to deal with the discovery of any unauthorized devices that you may have. You do a scan, you do a vulnerability assessment, and you don't have anybody to respond to it, then what good is that? Okay, and the same thing for your wireless devices as well. Now, those external sources that you have, again, should be used to identify those threats and vulnerabilities. When I say, I'm sorry, when I talk about external sources here, I'm not talking about the external team that I'm going to hire to come in and do a penetration test. I'm saying now you want to go out there and, we don't know everything. We don't know what we don't know. So you want to register to threat intelligence services and things like that to provide an early knowledge for you of potential threats and risks that's out there for your particular industry or organization. You want to register to vendor announcements and publications that's going to provide details on known vulnerabilities that's out there, and also might even give you some recommended patches or workarounds that you can use in your environment. And you want to perform regular monitoring, as I keep stating, on both of these points that I just mentioned here, threat intelligence and vendor announcements. You want to regularly look at that also. Monitor those. Make sure. What I used to do is set up automatic responses where I get new information from the sources that I use. All those vulnerability scans and all those penetration tests have to have approval from the system owners or a third party that own those devices being tested. And I think you know that, and that's common sense. But we don't do a vulnerability test or a penetration test on something we don't have the permission to do it. But I feel it's my responsibility to say that. And then your IT operations have to be made aware of those vulnerability scans and penetration tests and schedules and appropriate resources and things like that. Because, of course, our penetration test or our vulnerability scan could actually bring down the system. So we have to be prepared to deal with that. Now, if it's an external source and it's a black box test, you might not tell people that it's happening. You want to see their response. Part of the testing is to test their response. But if it's going to be internal, you want to let them know so they can be prepared. I did this at Disney World. I did a penetration test, 7 of us who went down, and we did bring down some things that we didn't mean to bring down. However, that was part of our testing plan, and as soon as it happened, they were able to bring it back up so they would not interrupt the operations at Disney World. Disney World didn't close down for our penetration test. We were doing these things as things were still happening, so we had to be prepared for that, and that was part of our plan. Very simple. Then we do an analysis. So roles and frequency. I'm sorry, let me take a step back. So I want to do an analysis now of all the information I gathered. And what I like to do, and you could do this or not, but have a monthly meeting that's going to take place that's going to talk about your findings. So if you're running scans monthly, have a monthly meeting. If you're running scans weekly, perhaps you want to have a weekly meeting with the stakeholders to discuss what it is that you're doing. Now, that vulnerability management analysis meeting needs to include, again, the proper individuals, the stakeholders that's going to be in place that's going to deal with this. Not just the IT folks, but other folks that's affected by it might be there as well. You want to make sure that all the device types with outstanding vulnerabilities are discussed in that meeting that you have. Okay? And then a monthly process must exist also for the list of identified vulnerabilities that you find. And that list of identified vulnerabilities is going to be mapped out to specific business critical services that we have to try to protect and deal with. So speaking of that, let's talk about risk criteria. So we're going to establish a risk criteria for everything that we have, for our devices, storing, processes, and transferring our business critical data. And we're going to rate that, right? We're going to rate it as high, low, medium, whatever rating system you want to use. But here's what I recommend. All vulnerabilities with a rating of critical or high, they have to be mitigated. They have to have a mitigated action assigned to them, first of all. And then we have to have a certain amount of time we want to deal with these things, depending on the criticality of it. Now, first of all, I said high must have a mitigating action assigned right away. All your other vulnerabilities must be assessed and action agreed to as to how you want to deal with those lower level findings. Now, my second bullet, critical or high vulnerabilities have to be mitigated within 3 days of the vulnerability being found. That depends, again, on your organization. Okay, it might be within 3 hours, depending on what your organization has in place. Okay, for those devices that's not storing, processing, or transferring confidential data, you might want to go back and do a further risk-based decision to decide how you're going to deal with this, or to agree on the appropriate action that you need to put in place for mitigating this situation. And then you want to have a risk mitigation list, and that's going to be an updated vulnerability list that's going to be appended with a mitigating action that you're going to do for that particular vulnerability, a date when you're going to fix it, and who's going to own that action, because somebody needs to be responsible, and somebody needs to report back to me on what has occurred and when it has occurred. Well, hey, you might be the person that's fixing it, but we got to have a plan so that we make sure that these vulnerabilities are taken care of. Make sense? And now we've assessed it, we've analyzed it. Well, we found it, we analyzed it. Now we got to fix it. So we want to do configuration and testing. All the standard changes, the non-emergency changes I talked about, the emergency changes, all of them have to be have to successfully go through testing in non-production environments before we deploy to a production environment. Common sense. Well, maybe not so common sense. You need to know that, because again, I told you many people put it straight to production. Now, the testing that we do needs to include a check to make sure that other security tools or previous patches or something like that don't negatively affect or won't negatively be affected when we put our new patch in place or our workaround in place. We don't want our patch, again, to break something. Any vulnerability mitigation that we do, be it a patch or a workaround or whatever, has to be entered into the change control system, as I stated before, and has to follow our change control procedures that we have in place. Now, of course, I said there could be some emergency mitigations, but those emergency mitigation has to be authorized with the relevant person or the relevant team before being applied to the live environment. Again, what is it going to affect? We must know that. And then we deploy it. So the vulnerability mitigation has to be completed by the date that I told you to put into that risk mitigation plan or risk mitigation list I mentioned before. Hopefully you will have that mitigated in accordance with that date that you have. And then on successful completion of the testing of that, we're going to notify all the stakeholders, or at least that relevant team again, before we turn it on, basically. Okay, the change deployment process. Oh, one other important thing that I have, my last point, that change deployment process, of course, have a rollback option. If we put a patch in place and start breaking things, we got to be able to roll back to our last good known baseline that we had. So that's going to be one of the most important things that you do. I told you with everything, it's very important that you monitor the situation. So again, I want to rescan, I want to retest after the fixes have been applied to demonstrate, number one, not just to find it, but I want to demonstrate that those high-level vulnerabilities have been successfully mitigated. That's my main thing. I want to make sure that the folks that have to answer to are calm and know that I fixed the problem. Okay. I'm going to do a report or a log has to be produced after deploying the patches. That's going to show again or confirm that we successfully did it. And then a vulnerability management or mitigation list needs to be monitored by us, the security team, who we want to have in place, for any outstanding vulnerabilities that still exist, that we haven't fixed by that completion date, or that's been escalated to a different team. I might find something I have to send to a specialist team that has to handle it. So we have to make sure that's taken care of. Now, in order to test access to our confidential information, the following types of testing is going to be used. These are some recommendations. Again, it's not the end all be all, but again, an external security vulnerability testing. And that testing is going to begin with reconnaissance techniques. That's going to search through public registration data and domain name service information or system service information and news group postings and all those type of things to try to help us identify vulnerabilities that might be present on our system, or some things that, remember, a vulnerability is something that can potentially be done to your system. It's not, it becomes a threat once people start trying to exploit it. So right now we're trying to just gather information. And then depending on the protocols that's allowed through our network, initial attacks are going to generally be focused on, those commonly used and allowed application protocols that we have. So we want to make sure we're taking a look at that, the FTP protocols and HTTP and our mail transfer protocols, and kind of gauge where those are and what we have to do. Those servers that are externally accessible are going to be tested for vulnerabilities that might allow access to internal servers and private information from folks on the outside. Those are where some of our biggest vulnerabilities are. And the last bullet I have there is external security vulnerability testing also concentrates on discovering access method vulnerabilities, such as, your wireless access points, and if you still have modems, your modems and your portals that you use to your internal servers. So all these are very important. That was external. And the internal, just going a little bit deeper into those, for internal security vulnerability testing, our testers need to work from the, again, as I gave you an example, the internal network, and assume the identity of a trusted insider. So it's almost like an insider attack. Somebody's already in our system, what would they do in order to break the system? So we want to do an internal security vulnerability test. We're going to do that by granting access to those testers who's going to perform that internal security vulnerability test on the application. And they're going to be granted some level of access to the network. It's not blind, like I mentioned before, with a black box. They're going to be granted access probably as a normal user, or what you call a general user. And they're going to be provided with information that that user would have at their privilege level. And their job is to escalate, see if they can escalate those privileges. Now, working from whatever level of access that I give them, those testers are going to attempt again to gain additional access to our network, and then as they increase their user level privileges to admin level privileges, see what they can get their hands on. Okay. So again, this is going to focus, my last bullet, focus on system level security and configuration to make sure that we're doing our jobs, we've hardened the system the way we need to harden it. Now, the next thing is that we want to do some overt and covert security vulnerability testing. And this is still probably external. It might even be internal. But let me tell you what my definition is for that. Overt security vulnerability testing involves performing external and or internal testing with the knowledge and consent of the organization's IT staff, as I told you earlier, enabling a comprehensive evaluation of the network or system. So overt is known. Again, covert testing is that black box or black hat testing, as you see me written here. Takes an adversarial approach to performing the test. So what I've just spoken about, that covers the assessment part of this, right? So it's very important for us to understand and know what our vulnerabilities are so we can fix those vulnerabilities. How do we fix those vulnerabilities? We fix it through patch management. This is one way. So now I'm going to cover a little bit about patch management in the minutes that we have left. So with patch management, that should be near the top of your concerns if you're a security guy or security manager, or even you're not in IT security, you're just concerned about your organization IT assets in general. Because network hacks, malware infections, even simple human error, mistakes that your folks make, can and will prevent your system from operating smoothly, and that's not what we want. So a proper patch management practice, well, I'll say practices need to be put in place so you can recover from that inevitable malfunction that's probably going to happen. So just as our organization has some unique technology needs, every successful patch management program is going to vary in design and implementation based on those needs as well. So I can't give you a one-size-fit-all patch management plan, but I can give you some best practices that will allow you to have a better patch management program. And that's what I'm going to attempt to give you here. First thing, I kind of mentioned this earlier when I talked about vulnerability assessments, but security and patch information sources. So as it says here, a key component of patch management is to intake and vet information regarding security issues and patch releases. All right, you have to know which security issues and which software updates are relevant to your own environment. So you need to have a point person or a team who's going to have the responsibility for going out and keeping up to date on newly released patches and security issues that affect at least your organization or affect your industry. And that person or team is also going to take the lead in alerting us or alerting administrators and alerting users and other people, other stakeholders of those security issues or the updates to the application system that they support and use. And then what you do is you're going to go out and have a comprehensive and accurate asset management system that's going to help you determine whether all those existing systems are accounted for and if we have the right patches and updates in place on those systems. The second part of that, the second thing, which is going to be to prioritize and schedule those patches. So you're going to have some, well, I'll say this, there's a lot of scheduling guidelines and stuff out there, but I have here several scheduling guidelines and plans to exist within your organization in a comprehensive patch management program. There's no one way of doing it. You know, it depends on the particular situation you find yourself in. So first, a patch cycle has to exist though, and that's going to guide the normal application of patches and updates within your systems. How often do you put in patches? How do you put in patches? You know, what's our cycle for patch management? Do we bring down the systems? All those things come into consideration. And that cycle doesn't specifically target security or other critical updates. Instead, it's meant to try to facilitate the application of some type of standard patch release program and updates. So it's not necessarily a security-related thing. It's just good patch management procedures, all right? You can make it time-based. You can make it event-based, whatever you have. So, for instance, the schedule can mandate system updates occur every month or every quarter or whatever you want to use. Now, the second thing I talked about here is scheduling. So the scheduling plan deals more with critical security and functionality patches and updates. See, the first one was just general patches. This is now those critical patches. And this plan is going to help you deal with the prioritization and the scheduling of those updates that by their very nature has to be deployed in a more immediate fashion. I have a problem, I got to fix that problem now. So a number of factors are going to be considered when you determine that patch priority and your scheduling priority and urgency. A lot of it's going to be driven by vendors. So you're going to have vendor reported criticality, you know, high, medium, and low, because they're going to come out and say they found a vulnerability and you need to fix it. So that's going to be a key input for calculating your patch's significance and the priority of that patch, you know, when you put it into your system. Other factors that should be taken into account when you schedule and prioritize are like your system criticality and your system exposure. You know, exposure to your DMZ systems versus your internal file versus your client workstations and things like that. So you have to look at that. The next one is patch testing. And again, I told you ideally you don't want to put anything straight into production. So ideally that the breadth and the detail of your patch testing is going to relate directly to the criticality of those systems, as I said, and the data that you're handling and the complexity of the environment that you have in place. So your patch testing process is going to begin with the acquisition of your software updates in the first place, and it's going to continue through the acceptance testing that you do after production or after putting it into your production environment. So the first component of your patch testing is going to will be the verification of where you got that patch from, the patch source and the integrity of that patch. And that's going to help you ensure that the update is valid in the first place, is that it has not been sent to you maliciously or accidentally altered or something like that. And then you're going to go through and put that patch in. So once you go ahead and determine that patch is valid, you're usually going to place it into a test environment, right? And then that test environment hopefully is going to mirror your production environment as closely as possible. But it should at least take into account your critical applications and things like that. And then you're going to go push it out. But right now we talk about the testing phase. You testing everything. Now I keep telling you that one of the most important things we have is change management. So with our change management process, that's going to be vital to every stage of your patch management process. All your system modifications, your patches, your updates, they have to be performed and tracked through your change management system. Okay? So I'm not going to beat that. I've been beating that since we started, but you have to have a change management process in place. And then you move to your patching, installation, and your deployment. So the deployment phase of that patch management process is where your administrators, your engineers, your security folks, well, actually, let me take a step back. Your administrators and your engineers are going to have the most experience, not your security people. Security people, we tell you what you need, but they know how to go in and put it in. They're going to do the installation and deployment of the actual patches and the updates to the production system and to the test environments and all that. Okay? So this stage is the most visible to your organization as a whole because they're going to see it. They're going to see patches, they're going to see banners talking about it, right? So the effort that you extend throughout the entire patch management process is going to dictate your overall success for your deployment and your patch management program in total. The most important thing is communication. Make sure when you're doing these things, you're communicating to the organization that it's going to happen and it's going to happen soon. So you're going to apply your patches, and then especially your security patches, you want to do it in a critical manner, or not a critical manner, but a timely manner, and they have to be made in a controlled and predictable fashion. And that's the main thing behind that. Last couple of things here is that you want to audit and assess them. You need to do regular auditing and assessment to help you gauge the success of that patch and of your patch management efforts, as we said. And you're essentially asking yourself two questions. First of all, what systems need to be patched for any given vulnerability or bug? And then are those systems that are supposed to be updated actually patched? Did it happen? Okay, so that audit and assessment is going to help you answer those two questions, but there's going to be some dependencies there. And two critical success factors for accurate and effective asset and host management is going to be, I guess these would be it. Making sure that you patching what you need to patch and that they're in place. Okay, which depends on what your goals. I don't want to belabor that too much. I want to go into the last one here, which is consistency and compliance. So while the audit and assessment part of it is important, and it's going to help you identify those systems that are out of compliance and need, more work to reduce the non-compliance, your audit and assessment efforts alone are kind of like after the fact evaluations of your compliance, since those systems being evaluated are going to already be deployed into production. So to supplement that, those post-implementation assessments, you should have controls in place that's going to ensure that newly deployed and rebuilt systems are up to spec, and at least in regard to the patches that we have. Okay, the system build tools that you use and the guidelines you use, they're going to be the primary enforcement means of ensuring compliance with the patch requirements at installation time. Remember, policies, procedures, and all that are no good without some type of enforcement in place. So as new patches are approved and deployed, build images and scripts need to be updated so that all those newly built systems are appropriately patched, and you have the associated build documentation with it that's updated to reflect those changes so people can keep up with those changes. So with that being said, hopefully you've got an idea about some point, and go back and take a look at the recorded version of this if you missed anything. I went through it quickly, but you have an idea of what a good vulnerability management and good patch management process should look like. Now I'm going to bring my partner on, from Beyond Trust, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about how we do this at Beyond Trust and what tools we use in order to do that. So now I'll pass it on the torch.
Great. Thank you, Derek. Great job. Yeah, real quick, I'm just going to cover a couple of key points that Derek mentioned there. Again, we should be able to see my screen okay here. Now, when you first start off the vulnerability solution, as Derek mentioned, we want to be able to prioritize. And so one of the first things we talk about with our solution is Beyond Insight, again, is that risk management platform that helps you organize, helps you mitigate, helps you report, again, everything that you need in order to have a successful vulnerability program. And so first, we want to make sure that the solution is going to call out the types of vulnerabilities that we want to go after first. And so that's what we're looking at here. This is a report that's based on what do we need to do first, right? We need to go after the vulnerabilities that can be accessed remotely without privileges that have known exploits in the wild. And again, this is going to give you that detailed list of things that you need to go after immediately in your environment. Now, additionally, Beyond Insight is a risk management platform. And so with that, we include the ability to patch straight from the solution, as Derek mentioned there. That's an important aspect of the vulnerability solution, is being able to patch. And so with that, we can create groups in the environment within our solution here, and these groups can call out different types of vulnerabilities that are needed. Additionally, which types of systems that we want to go after immediately. And so once we have that, because the solution includes a vulnerability patch management solution as well as a risk compliance and everything else that you need for the vulnerability solution, you can patch straight from the console. So you have your vulnerability, it's exploitable, we have the description of it, we know what to go after, we validated that this is a priority item, we validated that this is a patch that needs in my environment, and so I can go ahead and approve this immediately right from the solution and decide which systems are important to patch today. Are they the Windows systems? Are they the critical servers? Again, with this solution, we can patch straight from the console, so we don't have to worry about how are we going to deliver that patch? When will that patch be delivered? And additionally, as Derek mentioned there, compliance, right? Regulatory compliance is important. That's also included with the vulnerability solution. We have all of the regulatory compliance available to you, as well as those configuration compliance, those benchmark scannings. Again, everything is included with the solution. So when you're ready to deploy the solution, you have everything you need ready from the gate. Additionally, there's additional reports that you're going to want to run to determine if there are known vulnerabilities, known assets in the environment that should be taken a second look at. So again, Derek mentioned there that once you do your remediation, once you do your scanning in the environment, you need to know how things are looking after those efforts are taking place, after you've remediated. And so that's where we have our solution called Clarity, again included with the Beyond Insight vulnerability platform. Again, it gives you the ability to determine those assets that are the top risks in your environment. And so again, Beyond Insight will include all of these things, so that way you have a clear picture of which assets to go after first and which assets are those biggest risks. So that's my quick demo that I wanted to just provide to you guys. Again, we're going to open it up for some questions here. Give me 1 second. All right.
Thank you, Joe. All right, I will jump right in. Before we get into some Q&A, I'm going to launch one last poll, and we would love to help you guys with either your vulnerability management needs or your privileged access needs. So if you would be interested in engaging with one of our security specialists, we would love to talk to you, have a deeper conversation, or even show you a more thorough one-on-one demo. So take a moment. If you're interested in this, by being contacted by a Beyond Trust security specialist, select yes, and we will reach out to you within a couple of business days to discuss your vulnerability management or privileged access management needs. So I'm going to leave this up. Let's dive into some questions. Derek, just make sure you're unmuted. And you had a first question come in. When it comes to finding vulnerabilities and managing them, how do I know what to fix first? Derek, you might need to jump off of mute.
Okay, I'm sorry. Are you able to hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just talking away. You say, how do you know what to fix first? So there's a lot of different ways and various vendors out there that classify their vulnerabilities and prioritize their patches and things like that. Now, some of my favorites release patch updates once a month or on a regular cycle, and they say to start with some and finish with others. And what I mean is this. You're going to have criticals, highs, mediums, lows. You might rank it 1 to 10, whatever it is. There's a lot of different ways you can score it. But most people I talk to are going to start with their criticals or their highs or their 10s. And depending on what systems they're using, they're going to export that to a spreadsheet. And the next thing they're going to do is they're going to take in various feeds or whatever to determine what that criticality of those already marked critical vulnerabilities are. And they're going to do that through assessing what privilege that attacker is going to get if they have a successful exploitation, and how easy it's going to be for that attacker to exploit that vulnerability. And then that process is going to give them a prioritization matrix, kind of what Joe just showed in his matrix of some sort. And the analyst is going to then pick up the ones that he wants to send to their system administrator to go in and remediate. And give or take a few minor details, that's going to be a very common way of doing it, okay? But, you know, it could be time consuming unless you use a tool like the ones we're talking about, but that's a way of doing it. Get your highs and lows and all that first. Rank them and then start from the top and work your way down.
Derek, another one for you. When I run vulnerability scans, as you suggested, how do I know if it is a false positive? Is it potentially vulnerable, or is it something that we actually need to fix?
Just like I said with the different tools out there and the different ways to figure out what to fix out there, there's a lot of different scanning methodologies out there too. So each one of the vulnerabilities is generally going to be tied to some type of specific file or version or a registry key or service or something, or a combination of those. So if you're actually checking for those particular vulnerable versions out there, then you know whether you have a vulnerability or not. Now, on the other hand, if you're working backwards and you're checking for the absence of remediations, did things not occur, you could end up with a less accurate situation. For example, vulnerabilities 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 all have individual patches, but they also have patch A that remediates them all. So, you know, something might remediate all. So there's a couple of different methods. Let me tell it real quick. In method 1, I might do a vulnerability scanning methodology. So I'm going to run a vulnerability scan, and I'm going to find that I was vulnerable to some vulnerabilities, let's say 2 and 4 out of 1 through 5. I can remediate both those vulnerabilities with that patch A that I talked about, or I can have individual patches for each one of those vulnerabilities. Now, the second method, that was the vulnerability scanning method. I have a patch detection methodology that I use, and I'm going to run a vulnerability scan that's going to use the missing patches, and they're going to find them, and they're going to find out that I'm missing those patches, and then missing patch A, and then it's going to say I'm going to go out and fix that because I'm vulnerable to a particular vulnerability. So I'm going to find a patch for that. Now, remember I said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If I've already patched 1, 3, and 5, let's say, this type of detection is going to tell me it's going to yield a high level of false positives. And again, I don't want those false positives if I do it that way. But it's going to show me that I need to at least go out and investigate it a little bit further. So personally, I think method 1 is going to be the smarter way. Run a vulnerability scan, and it's going to be more accurate. It's going to give you less false positives, and it's going to save you a lot of time when you're investigating potential false positives and how to fix them. So that's the answer for that.
Okay, let's see. Let's look in. I had another question. Derek, what tools do you recommend for internal testing? Can you recommend any?
For internal testing? Well, you know, one of the standards that we have out there, if you're doing your network, you can still use Nessus. Nessus is still a good one out there that you run. It's going to give you vulnerability. It's going to give you all the vulnerabilities in your system. Now, let me tell you about it, though. It's going to show you every potential vulnerability that's out there. So I run it on systems, and I come back with 300, even 1,000 potential vulnerabilities. And I used to take that package at the Army Research Lab, and I just hand it off to somebody and say, here are your vulnerabilities. That's of no value to them. Now you have to have an expert that can look at those vulnerabilities and say what's applicable to our situation and our environment. Once we do that, so you use the Nessus tools and tools like that because they all work the same, and Nessus is the tool, but then you have to evaluate that output to make sure that it's important to you. Now, if you're doing your scanning an application, we have stuff like app scan, because the things that you use on the network, Nessus is going to be different than what you use on applications. So you use something like app scan, and it's going to scan the application and do the same type of thing. Give you a report, and then you interpret that report. That's the answer for that.
Okay, let's see. Brad's asking, you didn't mention exception processes, but what processes and tools do you surround that part of vulnerability management with? Obviously, not everything gets fixed. For example, exceptions, strong compensating controls, patches that cause system problems, etc.
So I'm not sure of that question, but I think it sounds like he's talking about ranking the criticality or ranking what things should be done. And again, it's going to depend on your organization and the situation you find yourself in. But again, that vulnerability scan is going to show you what it's going to tell you high, critical, and low. But let me say this: a high doesn't mean a high. And what I mean is that it might say that it's a high vulnerability, but in your organization, because of controls you have in place, it's really a medium or a low. So you have to do an analysis, as I spoke about, and see what your particular situation is. And then you determine, do I need to patch, or do I need to use this particular compensating control? And if there's not a control in place, do I have to do a workaround to make sure that whatever that vulnerability is covered? Hopefully that answers that question.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Derek. We're approaching the top of the hour, so I'm going to wrap this up. I did receive several questions asking about the slides, because I know there's a lot of content shown today. And yes, everybody here, and even those who registered and didn't attend, will receive a link to the recording and the slides shown here today, so you can go back and review or forward them on or share with your colleagues who maybe are interested in this topic as well. So be on the lookout for that follow-up email. It will come from communications@beyondtrust.com. So make sure that that email is whitelisted so you receive it without interruption, and you will receive that within 1 business day from now, so by the latest Monday. So with that, a big thanks to our speakers. Again, thank you, Derek and Joe. A pleasure, as always, Derek, for you being here and sharing your insight, expertise, and guidance for our audience. So we really appreciate your time. And thank you to everybody who attended live. Have a wonderful rest of your day. We'll see you guys in the next webinar.
See you in the next one.
Thank you so much. Take care. Yep. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.